All right. Hello, everybody. I see folks joining on, those attendee numbers clicking up. So I'm going to give everybody about a minute or two to log on and give everybody a chance to settle in. And then I'll do a quick introduction of our today's speaker and we'll get going. Let's see. Chat too. All right. Well, in the interest of time, I'll get going. I'll just do a brief introduction, and then I'll let Matt get underway. So today we are very excited for our next Brownbag speaker, Matt Rafalow. He's a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley in the Center for Science, Technology, Medicine, and Society. And he's also a social scientist at Google, and I think YouTube specifically. He just released a new book, Digital Divisions: How Schools Create Inequality in the Tech Era, and it's published in the University of Chicago Press. He also authored a 2018 book, Affinity Online: How Connected and Sharing Interests Fuel Learning. And his work is, appears in very prestigious journals like the American Journal of Sociology and Symbolic Interaction and Social Currents. And today he's going to be talking about digital division and how schools create inequality in the tech era. So we are very excited to hear from you, Matt. And without further ado, I will let you get going. Oh, sorry, quick note, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A feature, and then we'll spend the last
I think I lost audio there. Okay, looks like Andres dropped out. Can folks let me know in the chat if they can hear me? Okay, so we'll just kind of power ahead and hopefully Andres will come back. So thank you so much for that generous introduction. I'm super excited to be here. For folks that don't know, I actually graduated from the sociology department, and I see a lot of sociologists in the room. So thank you so much for coming. Hung out in the halls of the education department as well for the vast majority of my career. So it's a little bit of a homecoming. So I'm super excited to share with you findings from my new book here. When I was doing this research, I certainly didn't imagine we'd be living in the, dare I say, educational hellscape that we're living in now. What with the pandemic, everyone being forced to use digital tools. A lot of people in the room will know I was always obsessed with studying digital technology, and people were like, oh, do we have to talk about this? Well, unfortunately, we now all have to talk about this. And so I'm happy to kind of contribute in what way to that. And so hoping this will lead to some generative thinking, feedback, and questions. And one final note, I already see kind of people lighting up the chat, which I love. I really hate a boring chat. Going to talks where it's just someone talking at you, it's a little bit of a snore fest. So please feel free to use the chat to ask kind of constructive questions or kind of react, and I'll try to keep my eye on it as we go. But as Andres mentioned, I know we'll be using the Q&A feature as well. So one thing that if I could ask of you all to help me get to know you a little better is if you're open to just dropping, introducing yourself in the chat, maybe who you are, what department you're in, maybe a little fun fact or something like that. I would love that personally. So feel free to do that at your own pace. So I usually like to start briefly by saying a little bit about what I do, since most academics kind of raise their eyebrows a little bit when I tell them I'm a sociologist at Google. They're like, okay, what is that? I don't know what that is. So a little bit on that, and then we'll kind of get to the book. So I juggle two appointments, as Andres mentioned. I'm an industry researcher at YouTube, which is part of Google, and I'm also a visiting researcher at UC Berkeley in their STS department. And what I do at Google is I basically am a resident social scientist that advises on day-to-day product development work. So basically at Google, they divide us all into little departments that focus on one piece of YouTube, for example. I'm the only researcher, but I work with business types called product managers, a bunch of engineers, usually a couple hundred per team, designers who are amazing. If you've ever worked with them, they're basically like digital artists that use what we study as inspiration for then how to design systems. And we work together to try to figure out what to build. It's super applied, but it's also given me room to collect a new data set on YouTubers, which is where a lot of my new academic work is. And that's where UC Berkeley comes in. I can kind of straddle both of those worlds, do the applied stuff, but then collect these like crazy data sets with YouTubers and hopefully make something fun out of that. And so a note here is that for any of you, especially students interested in the tech sector and kind of doing work there, I do a lot of work to try to mentor folks on that end. And so if you have questions about that, happy to talk about that at the end as well. So my academic work follows two strands of research, all within this kind of broad vein of using sociological methods and theories to understand why it is people use digital technologies the way that they do. So in the first, which I present on today, I try to understand how educational institutions shape the way we interpret the meaning and value of digital technologies, and in ways that might lend to inequities, which I'll be talking about quite a lot today. Middle schools specifically is where my study is. And the second vein of work expands out into broader online publics. So I try to get at this through a few different empirical cases. I've studied online dating and how awful that can be, as some of you may attest to, but specifically in terms of sexual racism manifested in online environments. I've also studied online learning communities, and this is actually through the Connected Learning Research Network, which has a lab at UCI for some of you that might know about that, with Mimi Ito, who's fabulous. And my third line of work, which I mentioned, is now on YouTube influencers. What does it take to be, what is an influencer? What the heck does that even mean? What goes into the thought processes people create and share online? And I have a really fun academic team at YouTube dissecting some of this data, and happy to talk about that as well. So the book, what am I talking about? So basically this is an outline. I like kind of sharing ahead of time what I'm going to talk about. I know it kind of spoils the story a bit, but it helps kind of organize thinking for me at least. Basically, I'll start by talking a little bit about the theories I've been playing with, and then very briefly go through the methods so I can get to the fun stuff, the findings. I'll be speaking mostly about findings from chapters 2 and a little bit on chapter 4, which get at how teachers treat kids' digital play, and whether they can turn kids' play into something educationally seen as valuable, into achievement. Cultural capital basically is kind of the framing there. I won't be really getting into why teachers are doing this, and that's chapter 3. And the why centers on how teachers discipline kids play differently by race and class of their student body. That really gets into theories of race and organizations or workplace culture. And if you're listening and you're wondering, well, how would what you're talking about apply in other schools? That's the mechanism. That's chapter 3. And so if we want to talk about that, I'm happy to at the end. And then lastly, I'll share a little bit in terms of possible implications. I didn't do this study in the COVID era, but I think a lot of it applies today. And so I'll do a little bit of an overview there. And then hopefully we can get through all of that to have plenty of time for Q&A and discussion, and maybe some of this tech sector stuff if people are curious as well. But before we get into it, I will kind of make any excuse to talk about video games, which is a very big passion of mine. And I want to play a little game with you all. So, if you'll pardon the pun. So I know some of you in the room are probably gamers, or maybe just have seen video games, or are parents and have kids and have very strong opinions about it. So I was wondering if you could maybe take a second and think of the video game Minecraft. What do you think of video games like Minecraft? Is it fun? Is it amazing? Is it valuable? Is it distracting, kind of prone to harassment? No shame here at all. Type in the chat maybe one or two words that you think describe video games like this. Just your draft impressions. And I promise I'll come back to this, but something to think about. So cerebral Legos. Okay, I'm clearly speaking to a particular vein of education researchers here, because you can imagine the comments can look quite differently depending on the group. Creativity, I love it. Okay. Mind expanding, love that. Okay, so in the early 2000s, when all this digital technology stuff was really taking off, you could not miss the sheer volume of this like prophetic idealism about the power of technology. Technology will change the classroom. Technology will be, this is my favorite one, the great equalizer. When I started thinking about the work, this was the predominant frame of thought. And one interesting piece of this puzzle too is that young people were among the first adopters of many of these new digital tools. They could, in my mind, I was like, okay, maybe these kind of ideals, maybe it could work. Like these kids could put those new digital skills to use and succeed in class. But in 2015, I started reading about this news story featuring a 14-year-old at a school in Texas who was actually quite good at these types of digital technologies, that these idealist views of technology had described. This kid, Ahmed, himself was a digital tinkerer, and he had used available technology to quite literally build a digital clock on his own. This is not too far afield of these fabled kind of stories of Steve Jobs tinkering in his garage to become one of the most respected innovators of our generation, if not a bit controversial, to learn actually he wasn't the nicest person, in our learnings since. But, this kind of tinkerer ethos seemed to be similar to the story here. But something happened that was quite different than what happened to Steve Jobs. When Ahmed brought this homemade clock to school to show his teachers, they arrested him. They had him arrested. They handcuffed him, called the police, had him escorted off campus. Innovative wasn't even remotely top of mind to his teachers and administrators, who instead believed that he had made a homemade bomb and brought it to school. And I just kept thinking over and over, why wasn't Ahmed seen as an innovator instead of quite literally a terrorist? How does race factor in here and in ways that shape who gets to be an innovator? And I think who gets to innovator seemed to be a really good question. Fast forward to today, and Black and Latinx folks, for example, still make up a tiny minority of Silicon Valley workers, though there have been some small gains in Latinx representation, just looking at the kind of the demographic data. But what's particularly interesting is that even for increased gains in admission to the tech sector, it's basically run by white men. And so there's kind of an open question here of like, why so few people of color make it into the tech sector and then grow to lead it? And I think this is a very big question, of course, that can and it should and is being looked at a number of different angles. But thinking again about this story of Ahmed and his digital clock, I just couldn't shake this question of, what happens in schools? How do teachers treat kids' digital skills, especially if in this era, many kids are playing with these digital technologies already? And so among sociologists of education, Bourdieu is a go-to for many of us, and I think for good reason. His theory and the work by many others who extend his thinking show quite convincingly that the effects of kids' unequal childhoods have on their educational attainment is significant. And so even though I'm a cultural sociologist, and for faculty and students I know from sociology, they know I'm pretty obsessed with cultural sociology, I still admit that it's pretty jargony. Like Bourdieu is pretty hard to read sometimes. So I like to kind of boil it down into a story that kind of goes like this. So the idea here is that if you're a wealthy, a kid born into a wealthy family, then it's likely your parents are members of the dominant group of society. the same group that runs educational institutions. Wealthy parents thus socialize in their kids certain habits and skills, and Bourdieu refers to the product of this socialization as a kid's developed habitus. Then eventually, that kid goes to school and they start displaying those habits and skills in the classroom, like, for example, knowing when and how to ask for help, a teacher for help in class. And because those habits and skills are shared among the dominant class, meaning because teachers are looking for those skills as signs of achievement, whether or not they're listed on their formal curriculum, teachers then reward those displays with achievement. And this is what Bourdieu calls cultural capital. So from this point of view, many of us Bourdieuians refer to the habits and skills wealthy kids get from their parents to be a cultural resource. Some even liken it to a currency to get ahead, used to kind of pay to reap rewards in some sense. So this is kind of the Bourdieuian take. And so in sum, thinking around unequal childhoods thus argues that if kids show up at school on an uneven footing, wealthy kids will succeed ahead of less wealthy kids as a result. And the solve here that the literature suggests is one of so-called cultural mobility. If only by some magical way, students of all class backgrounds could have the same cultural resources, the same know-how, we would finally see greater gains among working class students. This is kind of a rehearsal of the educational literature in terms of cultural inequality. Well, funny enough, I thought that there might be a way following this logic. I watched alongside as the rest of the world as young people adopted digital technologies at rates that were unprecedented in the early 2000s. The Pew Research Center was really a stronghold in this, but they ran nationwide surveys with tempoed consistency and captured just how fast young people, relative to everybody else, started using things like smartphones, internet-connected smartphones, laptops, iPads, and video games to connect with one another. And in a landmark book by Mimi Ito and her colleagues, they really provided the most comprehensive documentation of what exactly kids were doing with these technologies at the time. And I think what they found changed the learning sciences and really, I think, bolstered a lot of our discussion about digital literacies. They found that kids use digital tools to what they call, these are emic kind of anthropological terms, hang out, mess around, and geek out, which are really emic genres of participation that explicate, what kids were doing, but really show that there are basic digital skills that kids had to learn just to play with friends online. So this included facility with hardware and software, the basics of online communication, digital media production, like creating and sharing audio, video, and images, many of which were skills that schools, especially middle schools, are increasingly tasked to teach their kids. And so the research questions here then that was wrestling with were, well, if kids are showing up at school with similar digital know-how, will that give working class children a leg up following this kind of Bourdieuian unequal childhoods thinking? But then also, like, does it have to be just about class? Like, this literature is sadly very class focused and doesn't really speak to race very much. So what about students of color as well and kind of intersections of race and class? How will teachers treat the skills from digital play that kids bring to school, particularly with mind to race and class differences in their student body? So these are the kind of questions that I've been thinking about. And so I mentioned that I like to kind of ruin the story a bit up at the front, and I'm going to do that for, like, I'm really going to tell you the full story before I go into it, but it helps kind of scaffold my thinking. So essentially what I argue is that the answer to these research questions rests on understanding how schools discipline kids' digital play and how they do so differently by the race and class of their student body. And critically, what I mean by discipline is not like yelling at a kid or, in the old days, kind of ruler slapping on the table. Excuse me. I mean this more in a Foucauldian sense, but very grounded in how, Bowles and Gintis describe the way that schools communicate to children messages about their creative self-worth and the worth of their creative selves to educational institutions. Bowles and Gintis would argue that working class children are treated like they're going to be future worker bees, and kids then internalize those perceptions and expectations long into their economic career trajectories. On the other hand, wealthy kids are treated like future CEOs. And so they're treated like that even as students, and they internalize kind of these behaviors and aspirations. But what I also argue critically is that class isn't just it. Race is an especially important factor here as well. And why is because teachers' race and class-based stereotypes of their students are one component that shape how they discipline kids' digital play. I find that at a school for mostly wealthy and white kids, they treat their digital play like it's going to help them get into Harvard. Like they're going to be, who their Instagram stories, whatever it is that they're doing, it's genius. But at schools serving less affluent students of color, teachers instead dismiss their digital play, the very same digital practices, as either irrelevant or threatening to schooling. And this means that only the school with wealthy white kids treat their digital play as cultural capital for achievement. All right, so I said I was going to breeze through the methods. I'm obsessed with research design though, so if folks want to talk about that after, let me know. But why middle school? Part of it is I wanted to go back. A lot of people actually don't study middle school. I don't really know why. Maybe it was like too traumatic for people, but it's a critical period for students' identity development and their later academic trajectory. Tracking is a little less likely to shape students in the way that it does in high school. And critically, these are grades where digital literacies are starting to be targeted for kids as well. And what I did is I did a comparative ethnographic study of 3 middle schools. One I call Heathcliff Academy, private school serving mostly wealthy white students. Another I call Sheldon Junior High, serving mostly middle-class Asian American students as a public school. And another public school I call Cesar Chavez Middle School, serving mostly working class Latinx students. I did about 600 hours of observation split evenly between schools over the course of a year, which I would never recommend to students considering ethnographic work. That was too much, too much to do, spread it out. And I also interviewed a strategic sample of 8th graders at each school toward the end of the project where patterns from observation were strongest. So importantly, just a little bit more on the methods. Each of these schools I picked because they were tech utopias in some sense. This meant they all had access to lots of different digital technologies, comparable technologies, laptops, iPads, interactive whiteboards, classroom management software, you name it. And the reason why that's important is because it helps me control for school level factors in digital access, trying to whittle away other possibilities that we might observe. Teachers at each school were primarily white and female, which unfortunately is characteristic of most schools nationwide. And I was also able to mitigate some factors differentiating between private and public schools, which in some cases I really lucked out on. And I'm grateful for, but I'm happy to talk about that after as well. Okay, so let's get to the fun stuff, the findings. What did I find at each of these schools? So first, I think it's nice just to start with a little bit of a descriptive portrait of technology access. And these data are from interviews of students that I conducted at each school, which were a randomly selected sample of half of 8th graders in one class from each school where, as I said, the patterns from observation were strongest. And these numbers match school surveys that teachers did as well. But essentially, the point here is much like national data from Pew, which is the purple bar, we see generational similarities in basic access to digital technology. This includes smartphone ownership, home technology, including at least one internet-connected laptop, gaming system, et cetera. And there were important differences in how much available technology there was, particularly in terms of quality and maintenance of technology. And this is especially important today when we think about what a full online learning experience requires. And I'll come back to this kind of digital access stuff at the end when we talk about COVID era bits. But for the purposes of this project, kids had enough of a baseline access to new digital technologies they needed to play online, which is the focus of this project, to develop basic digital skills touted by educational researchers required to play with friends. And importantly, all of these kids I interviewed said that they were tech experts of their family. They weren't learning how to use these devices from their parents, which I think gets to the Bourdieuian paradigm. Emily's question, do teachers lead text exploration efforts in each of these schools? So at the school level, the teachers and administrators worked hand in hand. And this is what made these schools a little exceptional, in the sense that the teachers and the administrators worked hand in hand to make technology available at their schools. They believed it was essential to help their kids, for different reasons, as I learned, but they worked together to make sure that school level access was as closed as possible, securing grants, getting buy-in for different funders to provide those technologies. And that was at the school level. But for young folks that I interviewed, and that are represented here, the kids got a lot of their technologies themselves. Even at the school serving less well-off students, they still had internet-connected devices, albeit not as many as in high quality, to be able to play with friends online. And there's a few reasons for that actually some other researchers have studied, and I'm happy to talk about that after as well. So I like to share this just to kind of show that it was kids that were learning from each other, not from parents, but it's an important step because the Bourdieuian paradigm says that parents are transferring these digital skills to their kids. And so I needed to learn where they were getting them from. And so, when I asked if they were learning from their parents, these kids basically laughed at me every time I would ask. Daniel, for example, a 15-year-old Asian American youth at Sheldon said, "I'm the techie of the family. My dad is good, but I'm better." Maggie, a white 13-year-old youth from Heathcliff said, "I know how to use programs that even my parents don't even know how to use." And Bailey, a 14-year-old Latinx youth at Chavez said, "My brother and I are both the tech experts of the family. We fix computers and programs together." And, kids learned from each other, they learned through play, but what were the things that they were learning? Like, what exactly did they get from this? Well, there are two genres of digital skills that they fleshed out for me that will come up again and again in how they appeared later on in the classroom. And the first is online communication. And depending on the audience, sometimes this is clearer to people, but people don't just know how to communicate online, how to text, how to send messages. These are things people have to learn. And these kids needed to learn how to communicate to play with friends. So that included online communication, like across social media, how to text, how to collaborate online, like on a shared document, or even just planning an event with friends digitally. And the second genre of digital skills that they learned is what we refer broadly to as digital production. This could be anything like creating and sharing new media, like an audio or an image or video, all the way up to coding or creating a world within a world, like learning about architecture or physics and design to build cities or towns within certain games. All the way to jailbreaking devices. And this is an example of jailbreaking here. What you see is not actually a Game Boy. It's actually an iPhone that you can go into the back end of the code to rewire it to play games like this, all of which require different types of skills. And so all of the students I interviewed developed one or more of these skills as part of play with friends. So in the story so far, I've learned that students at each school, no matter whether they were Asian American, white, Latinx, no matter income, fit a national portrait of baseline access to technologies needed to play online with friends. And they learned things like online communication and digital production. So what happened then when they brought these digital skills from play to school? So at Heathcliff, this is the school serving primarily wealthy and white students. Teachers there, as I mentioned before, saw digital skills from play as essential to school. So for example, Mr. Krause, the school technology manager, explained to me, "I always use the example of Steve Jobs going to his garage and tinkering around. Why can't the garage be at school? There's value in having school be a place where kids can come in, bring what they know from their own lives, and have their eyes light up with possibility and say, okay, maybe there's something I can do here and be passionate about. Over and over in interviews, I heard how Heathcliff teachers constructed kids' knowledge and passions from digital play as necessary to student success. Their predominantly wealthy and white students were seen as so-called Steve Jobs potentials. Okay, so as promised, this is where Minecraft comes back in. A lot of the students I talked to played Minecraft, and Minecraft came up a lot in class too, but please know, Minecraft is just one example of many other types of forms of digital play that I have, examples from my data that play out in the same way. But, Minecraft's kind of fun, so I thought I would use this as the example. So at Heathcliff, in day-to-day classroom life, teachers discipline kids' digital play by treating it as essential, as I mentioned, to classroom learning. So for example, a history class I observed, one class I observed, students were working on an assignment on their iPads about ancient Egypt. But one student in iShot I saw had Minecraft open on their iPad instead. And instinctively, I got a little nervous. I was like, what is this kid doing? Like, there's an assignment that's happening. The teacher was making his way around the room just to kind of check on work and saw the game, leaned over her shoulder and asked about that. He started asking, is that a pyramid? How did you build that? And after question, he eventually clapped his hands like teachers do to kind of get everybody's attention and asked everybody to gather around this student and pointed to it, said, look at what she did, citing that it was tremendous work. At Heathcliff, because teachers discipline play in this way, students were able to integrate their own online video, digital art, online writing, and even video game play as helpful for classroom life. Disciplining play in this way thus activated Heathcliff kids' knowledge as cultural capital for success. So, what was it like at other schools serving less affluent students of color? Well, it was a much different story. So teachers at Sheldon Junior High, the school serving mostly middle-class Asian American students, saw the digital skills kids learned from play not as essential, but as threatening to learning and to school. And their rationale was very explicitly racialized. I would argue that it's racialized at all schools, but it came up very explicitly in their explanations. So for example, Miss Finnerty, an 8th grade science teacher at the school, explained to me, I feel bad for our kids here. They grow up with a tiger mom culture and are taught from a young age to only get A's or they have failed. It's terrible, but it makes it hard for us as teachers because they're taught to do anything to do well. And that's not fair to our students. Another teacher, Miss Nisbet, who teaches 7th grade, said, we've had a bunch of suspensions this year because these Asian kids are so good at using technology that they hack our online system. They'll do anything to do well. Sheldon teachers constructed kids' technology use as an extension of these assumptions about Asian Americans as tiger mom raised hackers who will cheat to succeed. Thus, their disciplinary approach to play was one that saw it as threatening to school. And this, of course, had heavy implications for how they disciplined signs of kids' digital play in class.
All right, everybody. Seems like maybe Matt is having some connection issues. I thought it was me because it's very windy over here, but I guess it was Matt. So my guess is he'll log back on just as soon as he can. Too bad. That was really interesting. I was excited to hear where he was going to go next. But yeah, let's give him a minute or two to recover back onto the call. And just a quick note about the Q&A. We're going to please put your questions in the Q&A feature on the bottom, and then I'm going to sort of moderate some discussion after he finishes his talk. And please write, maybe student or put an asterisk or something next to student questions, because we want to make a point to prioritize student questions and make sure they get a chance to engage with Matt. So yeah, maybe take a moment, gather some thoughts, put them in the Q&A, and hopefully he'll be able to rejoin us very, very quickly.
Hey folks, sorry about that. Really good time for internet to go down at my entire unit. So, Andres, can you see the talk? Okay, cool. So I will reboot myself from my gripping tail, and I've lost the chat, which I now have. All right, thanks everybody for your patience. So essentially, teachers, went down to the level of discipline where they linked kids' IP addresses to tracking that they did at their own school. In some cases, printing out messages kids would send to each other unbeknownst to them to be able to show them you should not be talking to each other while you're at school. And in other cases, teachers would use technologies on their devices to monitor what kids were doing on their own individual iPads or computers, kind of like little surveillance cameras. Needless to say, disciplining play in this way rendered the knowledge kids brought to school about digital technology as threatening, and it was not activated as cultural capital for success. And at the final school, Cesar Chavez, the one serving mostly working class Latinx students, they had a third approach to kids' digital play. Their teachers saw the digital skills they brought from school not as threatening, but simply irrelevant to learning. So for example, Miss Duffy, a 7th grade teacher at the school, said, "These kids aren't naturally gifted at technology. Those skills playing video games, they don't translate to school. So they have fast phones, so what? The kids we teach, if we're being realistic, they need skills for hands-on jobs, like how to fix a new wave car. If they learn technology, it's for that purpose." Miss Geller, a 6th grade teacher at the school, explained to me, "I don't know that these teachers are going into managerial positions after school, but they need to know a different set of skills than it used to be in factories. They need basic skills in using computers, research, programming, even making websites." That's the future for these kids. At Chavez, teachers over and over described their students as quote unquote hardworking immigrants just trying to get ahead. And they, these white teachers, saw themselves almost like parents who believed that the best way to help their students is to help them learn quote unquote basic digital skills with technology. And so that means they followed this kind of basic skills discourse that meant that when it came to tech, kids' creativity is fine, but it's not going to help them succeed in school. So they just focused on teaching rote digital skills. And so what this meant in the classroom was super interesting. They didn't police students' digital play in the classroom like they did at Sheldon. They just simply saw it as frivolous. Yes, Emily, the poker face was real that I had to, happy to talk about that at the end in terms of interviewing. But basically, they talked about kids' digital play as frivolous. It was like a fun reward for after they've done the hard work, which for any kind of Marxist in the room, I was like bells ringing. I was like, whoa, like Marx said that actually one of the craziest things about capitalism is the way it divorces one's creative self from work on the ground. And it sounds like that's how teachers are imagining work and play in this context. So instead, teachers favored rote digital skills that they determined were important, things like typing and the basics of coding, downplaying the value of creativity in every little project. Some of you, particularly at the School of Education, may know about a program called Scratch, where kids can kind of play around online and learn how to program. This school had Scratch too, but they would even downplay creativity while using that, making jokes that like, I don't care how cool your SpongeBob is, as long as you get the problem right, that's what's going to give you full marks. So this disciplinary approach to play is one that treated kids' digital skills as irrelevant to school. And like Sheldon students, this meant that those skills were not translated to cultural capital for achievement. So I think because of the Wi-Fi disconnect, I'm running a little behind on time. But basically, to summarize, I observed 3 disciplinary approaches to play that had a direct impact on whether kids' digital skills from play could be activated. One school saw them as essential, another threatening, and another irrelevant. And what this shows, without even going into the mechanism, like where these ideas teachers are coming from, is that our theory from cultural mobility is false. Even if kids have a similar baseline set of digital skills, a cultural resource that's increasingly valued by educational institutions, and especially so in the stated vision that each of these schools had, those skills are treated differently by the race and class of their student population. And so kind of going back to this little Bourdieuian chart from before, what it shows is that, all kids had basic digital skills from play, but it was unequally rewarded. And the missing piece here, which is my biggest critique of sociology of education and cultural sociology in education, is that scholars either do not study students of colors or literally quite ignore how race factors into the work that they're doing. Kids' valued habits and skills are indeed seen as a cultural resource or a currency to get ahead, but in this case, only if you're white. The metaphor from Bourdieu should not be that if you have the right currency, you can get ahead in class. I argue that the metaphor should be schools determine whether they will even accept your currency based on student class and race. So usually when I end things here, people still have a lot of questions like, well, how does disciplining play matter beyond achievement? How might it matter kind of beyond school? And so I have a little bit of a bit there that I want to go through. And I think maybe I'll pause after that. If folks want to talk about COVID stuff, I can go there, or we could kind of do Q&A. But I really like this kind of last part, just because I think it opens our minds a little bit about internet studies. So something that was really crazy from this is that I find that, there are these different disciplinary approaches to play, essential, threatening, and irrelevant. But it actually shaped how the kids I interviewed saw the value of their own digital participation, not just inside school, but outside of school. So remember at Heathcliff, the school with mostly wealthy white students, teachers disciplined them by telling it was essential, right? Well, in interviews, Heathcliff students internalized that by explaining to me that they learned that what they did online was also essential to doing well in school. So what they did is that they used digital platforms to participate online in ways that left digital footprints that made them look like a college resume for future admissions officers. Some of these 8th graders even created LinkedIn accounts, 8th graders, to help them look worthy for the best colleges. And remember at Sheldon, the school serving mostly Asian American middle-class students, they were told that digital play was threatening. Well, Sheldon students in turn learned that their online participation is risky. Even if they played around publicly online, that meant that teachers could find it somehow and punish them for it. So they either locked their social media accounts from public view or used tools to ghost online, meaning that their digital footprints were never linked to them as individuals. And so what this meant is that they would not create public presences in the way that Heathcliff kids did, either for teachers or for future college job prospects. It led to students' erasure of the self from public view. And lastly, recall that at Chavez, teachers disciplined play as irrelevant, right? Well, in turn, these kids told me that they learned that what they did online was truly just for fun. It didn't matter to school. And so when they played online, it was mostly with and for family or friends. But since they were told that schools didn't care about what they did online, they ended up curating very public digital footprints that were never intended for future employers or future college admissions officers. Rather than looking like they were curating a digital resume, their lasting presence is limited to messing around for fun with friends. So what this does, I think, is it creates an asymmetry by race and class, and not just whether kids participate online, which is a lot of the focus of online quant work among young folks, but how they participate in ways that I think are really worthy of studying for implications beyond school. Like, what do future college and employer kind of folks think of these digital footprints that kids are leaving? And in what ways has school shaped the extent to which kids are doing that? So I have a whole thing for implications of COVID. Happy to talk about that, but maybe we'll just pause here and I'll let kind of you all guide what you want to share and what we want to talk about. This has been a lot of fun, and it's been a privilege to talk with you all.
Thank you, Matt. That was extremely thought-provoking and really powerful thoughts. I really appreciate you sharing, and I'll give the folks in the audience a minute or two to gather thoughts, and please put them in the Q&A feature. Although I can, read stuff from the chat, but the Q&A feature just makes it a little bit easier for me to facilitate. Okay, so we have a couple questions already in the Q&A. So I'll start with the first one, which is from Allison Starks, one of our PhD students. And she's wondering if the schools were interested and aware of digital divisions when they agreed to participate, and what kind of takeaways were they looking for, and what did reciprocity look like?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So essentially, I think if I were to kind of look back on it, I think part of why these schools really wanted to work with me is that they were really proud of the extent to which they had closed digital divides. And they wanted some legitimation and validation that they were doing the right thing. Beyond that, there wasn't really any ask from them to kind of give back. And, as a student, at UCI, I remember at the time when I was doing this field work that I was obsessively reading about reflexivity and about giving back as part of ethnographic practice. And I think where I landed was that I decided actually not to go back to the schools to share what I learned. Because at the time, the way that I had observed, and I didn't talk about chapter 3, but it basically gets at the workplace conditions for these teachers and what it was like to be there on the job. And I made a judgment call that if I were to go back and share this information, it wasn't clear to me that it would be used productively in a way that would drive healthy conversations about race and equity in the classroom. I think since then, I have really changed how I think about it. And I'm now going through a process of like, is there value in kind of going back now after many years? And no offense to academia, I love my department for faculty, that are here. But one thing that we don't get as academics is training to do this kind of applied work, to run workshops, to distill findings in a way that practitioners and academics can work with together productively. And I think now that I'm at Google, that's what I have to do. I have to apply social science work. I actually have a lot more tools now to be able to kind of constructively do that work. And I'm partnering with a local organization in Southern California called CCEJ, which you folks should absolutely check out. And I'm giving all my book revenue this year to that organization, but they do anti-racism trainings with schools. And so I'm working with them through expert practitioners that do this work to do that. Because no offense to us academics, we can do research well, but we're not exactly the best at coming up with solutions always. And there are people out there that I've been partnering with increasingly to do so. So a bit of a roundabout way to answer your question, but hopefully that gives some nuance.
Yeah, and actually, thank you. And that was a two-part question from Allison. She also wants to know, where do you think special education teachers and students fit into this conversation? And did they come up at all in your data?
Yeah, so I did not focus on special ed, on uh, student disabilities as well. And I absolutely think this is like a critical topic here related to this work. I kind of suggest folks check out, scholars like Meryl Alper. She's done a lot of work in this space. I've also talked to some families with kids with disabilities lately who are describing, especially in this kind of COVID era of online schooling, that um, even among their children, some of whom have disabilities, some don't, they're experiencing different treatment from teachers, even than they did back in in-person learning. So I don't unfortunately have much to add in terms of findings, but just an underscore that this is a super important and related topic, and to check out Meryl Alper's work and stay tuned for what I know are going to be more research on the topic.
Great. Okay, we have another student question from Cassandra Flores. She wants to know, did you learn anything about parents/home environment while conducting interviews across the different schools, and did anything stand out about that?
Yeah, I think because I was focused primarily on the school level, I didn't do parent interviews, but what I did do is understand how teachers treated parents at each school. And that was a very important part of the story. So at Heathcliff specifically, parents basically ruled the land. And this is part of kind of, I think one of the most important differences about private to public is that parents at the private school held the school with their wallets. They basically were able to apply tons of pressure to make teachers use the latest and greatest technology, and in ways that I think most importantly pressured teachers to treat their students like elites. That kind of expectation of elite treatment, I think, informed this kind of future Steve Jobs perception they had of their students. And I think some of the ethnographic moments of parent involvements were some of my favorite because they're just so ridiculous. Um, for example, one way parents applied this pressure to teachers was through baking, of all things. So think of middle school, right? Bringing in baked goods. It's a cute way to kind of be involved. Well, baked goods, if you were to ask any teacher at this school, was not just about bringing in food for the teacher and the students. It was an open door approach where a parent could just show up at any time without any warning and bring in brownies so that they could surveil and kind of sniff out what was going on in the classroom. And if they didn't like what they'd see, they would start spreading the word with other parents. It would get to the administrator. It would put the teacher on blast and kind of pit them against one another. And in fact, technology was a big part of this. If they didn't see teachers using the interactive whiteboards as much or getting their child up to use it as much as they could, it would make teachers look like they were doing a disservice to the children. Whereas at other schools, like Sheldon, for example, actually the parents were trying to be just as involved as parents at Heathcliff. But teachers there did everything, they applied that same kind of stereotypical imagery to parents and did everything they could to minimize parent involvement, including, you learn all these weird strategies that folks come up with. They would use their classroom management systems to release student grades at the last possible minute before the weekend, for example, so that parents wouldn't really have an opportunity to regroup and follow up. So, I didn't interview parents, but the lens of how parents were treated and the extent to which the schools differently enabled their participation, I think is an essential part of the story.
Great, thank you. Okay, the next question is from Paul Hanselman, who's one of our faculty. And he says, thank you. And it says that there's been some efforts to assess the prevalence of these kinds of culture interactions you're describing in large scale data, and especially with existing surveys with mixed or limited success. Do you think new, bigger data provide new opportunities in this space, or is it foolish to pursue population type questions about these constructs So thoughts from you and your work with YouTube data specifically.
Interesting. It's a little less clear to me how YouTube data might fit in, but maybe your question comes from a lens of like, what methodologically can we do to kind of better understand this? And I think, some of what I've thought about a lot when it comes to mapping teachers' stereotypes, particularly from a quantitative lens, is that there was this huge kind of set of work in the 1900s to really try to get at this. And a lot of it didn't kind of really map out, like it was hard to really, I'm sure there are people in the room that are expert on this topic as well, but my read of the literature was that it was pretty tricky to map teachers' assumptions about race and class to actual treatment in the classroom and educational outcomes quantitatively. One of the things that I find interesting from this work, and this again couples with the part on teachers' workplace cultures, is that one, it might be tricky methodologically to get especially white people to admit the stereotypes they have, when sometimes they don't even know it themselves due to colorblind kind of ideology, which Bonilla Silva writes about a lot. And so maybe there are better ways to ask questions to get kind of teachers to flesh them out. But the other problem here is, and this is a problem in the sociology of culture, is that I find that teachers, even the same teacher, can have multiple stereotypes about the same student, racial, ethnic, and class group. So I find, for example, that depending on the school teachers taught that I interviewed, they would describe Latinx students through this kind of horrible future gang member stereotype. But at the school that I was at, they were hardworking immigrants. And so not only are there multiple stereotypes that teachers can draw on, but we need to understand what shapes why they're applying it at the school. And I actually find that teachers' workplace environments are a key part of that. So at Sheldon, for example, teachers there described work at this place as like a hellhole. They described it like the other people they worked with were like women from Mean Girls who wouldn't let them sit with them at lunch. It was like a hostile workplace. And so they saw other teachers as threats. And in turn, they also saw their students as threats, which I try to argue in the book. They linked that kind of workplace threat orientation to stereotypes of hackers rather than model minorities where they might elsewhere. So it's a pretty complex interaction, I think, of teacher stereotypes in workplace environment. And I think there's probably a lot of really cool mixed methods or quant leaning work that could help map some of this stuff. But I think existing approaches to kind of map teachers' assumptions about their students might suffer because of this, a little bit of a lack of nuance there. So, yeah.
Okay, great. Our next question is from Mariella Nicholson. And she wants to know if you know of any schools, particularly economically disadvantaged and high populations of people of color, where they've been able to move outside of the norms you found in your study and encourage this cultural capital of technology.
Great question. I will blame sociology a little bit for forcing me to kind of always look for the darker story. I think we're just naturally drawn to kind of studying, inequality primarily. But I might actually bounce that to, I know Amanda Wortman's in the chat from the Digital Connected Learning Lab, that I think primarily does work that's trying to like chart a brighter path for all of this. And so they may know of other research or other sites where it actually is going in the right direction. But I think I would underscore part of why I really love some of the principles of connected learning theory is that it centers on students' interests as something that's really important to help kids feel connected to their work. And what this research shows, in kind with other scholars' work like Prudence Carter and Angela Valenzuela, is that schools systematically tell kids of color and lower income kids that their interests are not going to help them succeed in school. And so if we can reframe pedagogy around supporting kids' interests and work through the biases that we have as instructors to enable that, I think that that's a productive pathway. Maybe it's naive, but I think that would be the North Star.
Great. I think we have time for probably one more question. We have one here from Gustavo Carlos, one of our faculty, and he's wondering if you could say something about the negative side of online and internet play. Game and internet both have good and bad content, and certainly kids can learn digital skills, but those skills can be applied for bad. Kids might be playing other games and might expose them to negative scripts and behaviors that could undermine education. So any thoughts you have on those topics?
Yeah, I think, this is part of what we did as part of this book we did with Mimi and her team, Affinity Online. I think that part of internet research, what it shows is that the internet is not one big wild west, but there are actually networks of people that get together and hang out and develop shared worldviews and expectations. And certainly that can take a turn for the worse. There are certain gaming communities, for example, around, I'm not a big fan of Call of Duty. It's hard for me to find positive outcome. I'm sure you can make an argument for collaboration skills, but perhaps there are other networks of online communities that young folks can participate in and play and learn. So I think my short answer, I know we're running out of time, is, we as educators and parents and, friends of youth and young adults kind of be bouncing sounding boards to, where are they hanging out? What are they enjoying? What are they not enjoying? And being kind of like a critical thinking voice to reflect on, where should they be spending their time? How will the skills be valuable or not, et cetera.
Excellent. Okay, so we are at the 1 p.m. mark. So unfortunately, even though we still have some great questions left, I think we're going to end it. But I do encourage you to reach out to Matt if you still have questions, and to connect. And also for students who are curious about what it's like to work in industry. He also suggested that he was open to engaging in those kinds of dialogues. And so huge thank you, Matt. This was a fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it, and I think our audience did too. And yeah, I really appreciate you sharing your time and your work.
Thanks for having me. This was awesome.
All right, see you, everybody. And this recording will be posted as well for those of you. Well, I guess those people won't be here anymore. Anyways, thank you. Bye, everybody.